I am back with Annabelle Anders, who just read a sample from Hell's Bells, her Rita nominated novel. So, one of the things that you mentioned before reading and also after is that Marcus is, I think the word you used was man whore.
Yes.
Do you find yourself attracted to specific types of characters, or is he one of the only man whores that you've written? How do you think about that when you're going to think about your
It's
collective
evolved for
work?
me, definitely depending on the trope and as I change as a person. So I realize now, even though he's a bit of a man whore, I think so many of my heroes are really marshmallow heroes. I try to write the alpha holes and I just can't do it because I can't. I know that that is a thing that so many people like, but I just remember reading the old Harlequin romances, and of course they were all single POV, so you never knew these guys, and these guys seemed so mean and cold. And I mean, in some ways it was very romantic, but I got really tired of it at a young age.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that is kind of an interesting thing I think about this book, but about Marcus in particular, is in the first couple chapters of the book, my heroine watches him with a widow. She watches how he functions in a ballroom, and then of course she goes and hides in the library. And then he and the widow show up in that library, and I describe her watching him. And my first editor had come to me, and she used to work for Trad Publishing, and she said, "You can't have this scene in this book. It's a romance. You cannot have him with another woman." And I was like, "Oh my God, but that's what the whole story is based on." And I had written the whole book, and I had a different friend who was doing indie publishing, and I'm all indie now. And she said, "Anne, you're writing an indie book. You write it however you want." That was pretty
Mm-hmm.
freeing for me. And so, yeah, so, that sometimes, it's one thing I like to try to get in my book is some sort of scene that you just won't find in other scenes. I like the characters where they might be saying one thing, but they're doing nice, sweet, loving things kind of in the background, or, it kind of comes out eventually.
Right.
So,
They're almost lying to themselves and their actions are telling them.
yes, yes, they gotta be cool.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned that you used to read Harlequins. Who are some of the authors that have most influenced your writing or your career?
I never would be a writer if I weren't a reader first. And definitely that would be Judy Blume when I was like a kid. And I don't know if you've watched the documentary of
Mm-mm.
her life as an artist. Every author retreat I go to, I force the whole group to watch Judy Blume. If you get a chance to watch that documentary, it's just like just how much she affected people. But anyway, that pulled me into reading initially. And then I read contemporary for a long time, and my mom gave me a Mary Belloc book for Christmas, probably around like 2010, 2011. And I read Mary Belloc's entire backlist. I love her style of writing. And so much so that when I wrote my first book, I submitted it to publishers because that's what you were supposed to do at that point. The editor sent it back to me, and I had totally written it in Mary Belloc's style. There's like a past sort of thing she gets going on. And she's like, "You can't do this." And I was like, "Oh," I was like, "I guess I'm not Mary Belloc." But definitely she pulled me in. And then, Lisa Kleypas and some Julianne Long, What I Did for a Duke. There's like a scene in that book that if you ever haven't read that book, it's just got this one scene that if you read it, you'll know what you would know. It's just so, there's these nuances, I think, that are so key in historical romance where they're saying things and they're doing different things. And I'm trying to lean into that. It's tricky to try and, when you're trying to produce a lot of books really fast, but I've kind of tried to slow down a little bit and lean into that sort of thing a little bit more.
Yeah. So speaking of, you have published 40 full novels plus novellas, I know, since 2017, and we're recording in 2024. So that's 7 years. So how do you stay inspired and curious enough to keep coming back to the page?
Well, I have to be reading. Ironically, I have a really hard time reading historical since I've been writing historical so long. I think it's my imposter syndrome where I'm just like, oh, and I don't want to be using other people's ideas. Even though it shows up unintentionally. You'll be reading a book, and there's only so many scenarios you can have in historical. And I find like that I don't want to avoid a scenario because I've read it in somebody else's. So I read a lot of contemporary, but I have to be reading in order to be writing. I find if I get into a reading funk, it's harder for me to write. And I have to say, I wrote more in the beginning. I'd actually written 3 or 4 books before I got published. And when I bartended at the same time, I was bartending at a hotel here in town. And what was interesting about that was writing was my fun thing. It was my side thing. And I would be driving to work thinking about my story. I'd be waiting on people, writing down ideas about my story in slow times. And so when I quit, I had to really make an adjustment because then suddenly writing is work. And that has been a struggle. And so I say I try to get my motivation from reading just other contemporary stories. And then I went to England in May, which was very inspiring. I have to say, of all the books I've written set in England, I had been to England when I was 17 for about 12 hours. It was like a stopover. So I really didn't know what England felt like. I went with Nicole Locke and Deb Marlowe, and Virginia Heath showed us around, which was just magnificent.
Amazing.
She showed us around we took us all around the Cotswolds and Bath, and we met up with Kate Bateman, and it's just so, and a couple other authors over there. It was amazing. And I came back, I was so inspired. I spent a week in Cornwall. So I had to put Cornwall in my book that I released after I got home, but it's been harder. I mean, I'll be honest, like going through hitting menopause as a person with ADHD, the last couple of years have been really, really rough to just
Mhm.
try to stay creative and keep producing, especially as I'm doing it as a living. But finally feeling like, and I'd gotten COVID a few times, and there's like a COVID fog, but it's kind of crazy. Like one hand is like the waitressing was great because I got all my footsteps in. I was like moving around all the time, but I hated having to work for someone else.
Yeah.
But writing is ultimately it's a job when we do it, and you have to figure out ways to keep everything functioning properly.